this video I'm going to show you how I made this pinch pot pitcher or jug. It's a double pinch pot, which means I make two separate pinch pots and then join them together in the middle. It's also called a composite form. I start off with a ball of clay about the size of a large orange, and then I press my thumb into the middle of the clay. Keep pressing until you can just about feel your thumb with the supporting hand, but making sure that you're not going right the way through. And then you start to pinch the clay out with your thumb and your forefinger, mainly your forefinger, but you can use the rest of your fingers too. Keep pinching and opening up the clay. And you work up a rhythm. It's like pinch, turn rhythm. And as you pinch, the walls of the pot will slowly begin to open out. And if you notice that the base of the pot is staying quite thick because your thumb can't quite reach down there into the middle, what you can do is use the tips of your fingers just to gently draw the clay up the side of the pot, as I'm doing there. Because what you want to do is make sure that the walls of the pot are as even as they can be. And if it's a reasonably large piece of clay, it can be quite difficult to get your thumb right in there. And just check the thickness. You can feel the thickness of the base with your thumb and forefinger. And then when you're happy with it, just keep pinching up the sides of the walls again. And if you notice any cracks forming on the top rim of the pot, just smooth them out with your thumb as you go, because if you keep pinching and the cracks keep widening up, then the cracks can really open up when the pot's drying. I find it's best to use clay that's reasonably soft, because otherwise it can be very tough on your hands. So what you can find is that the clay itself the bowl shape can start spreading out and widening out a little bit more than you want it to. So what I do is I invert it on a banding wheel, and then I just, as you can see, just pressing the sides together to round it out again, so that it hasn't flared out quite as much. And then when I'm happy with the shape, what I do is I cover it loosely with a plastic bag and I leave it overnight so that it becomes soft, leather hard. Don't want it to be really hard because you're going to still do a little bit of shaping the next day, but it needs to be firm enough so that it's not going to distort in your hands. So there it is the next day. It's sort of soft, leather hard, and what I'm doing is I'm just thinning out the walls of the pot just a little bit more and reshaping it. And at this stage, because the clay is still quite soft, you can put your thumb in there and just round it out a little bit more. And that's me just pressing the sides out where I can see little sections that aren't quite round. You can just press it out a little bit more. And then when I'm happy with the shape, what I do is I use a platter tool, which is this long, thin green plastic tool that you can see, to start to smooth out the inside of the pot. This is just scraping away the main lumps and bumps on the inside. Although whoever looks down into the jug isn't going to be able to see absolutely all of the inside surface, they will be able to see some of it, so it's important that it looks nice. So once I've used the platter tool, I just use a metal rib again to scrape away any textures that are left over. And I usually use the same thing to smooth out the inside of a pinch pot bowl. I'll start with a platter rib, then I use a metal rib, and then finally I go over it with a rubber rib just to compress the surface of the clay and to give it a really lovely, smooth, soft, velvety finish. So what I do is I make two bowls exactly the same size, using the same amount of clay and the same technique. And then once I'm happy with them both, the idea is that you join them together. So here I'm making a little supporting structure with a jug, a towel and a plastic bag. I put one bowl on top of the plastic bag, and then I lower the other bowl on top of the bowl underneath and line them up. I sort of turn it around and try and find the point at which they line up best, where they fit together at best. And you'll see you have to do a little bit of tweaking and kind of moving the walls around a little bit, just to make sure that they fit together well. And at this point, because the clay is still a little bit plastic, then that's fine, you can do that quite easily. And then when I'm happy with how they've lined up, what I do is I use a wooden modelling tool just to make a mark on the clay where they've joined up, so I know where to join them up together again when I'm fixing them together. And then I use a serrated rib tool just to score into the rim of one of the bowls. You don't have to use a serrated tool, you can use just a fork or even a pencil. You just need to scratch into the edge of the clay so that when you join it together it bonds together really well. This technique of joining two pieces of clay is called slip and score. So you score the surface of the clay and then you paint a bit of slip onto the scored surface, and that creates it's like a glue, it's like a clay type glue on the surface of the clay so that they bond together really well. So repeat the process on the other side. And if the clay is really soft and contains a lot of water, you don't always need to slip and score, but because this clay has been left to become soft leather hard, then it's really important to make sure that the two pieces bond together well, because otherwise they might break apart when it's being fired. So there you can see I'm lowering one half of the pot onto the other using the score mark that I made earlier on to make sure that they line up well, so that I'm joining them together in the place where they fit together best. And when they're lined up well together, I just gently squeeze the two pieces together and try and make that join as firm as I can without distorting the two clay bowls. So just going around and squeezing the two pieces together and making sure that join is really firm. Then I use a wooden tool to blend the clay sleet seam in. So there's two reasons for doing this. One is to get rid of the join mark, but also the other reason is to just make sure that the two pieces of clay are really firmly bonded together. And you can use your thumb if you like. It's a little bit tough to do that at this point because the clay is quite firm, but you can use your thumb. I prefer to use a wooden tool. And then once the clay has been blended in once, what I do is I tend to turn it on its side and then go around it again. And the second time I go around blending it, I will try and blend it in the opposite direction to the blending marks that I used before. It's just a way of making doubly sure that it's very firmly attached, so there's no weak points in the structure or the seal. Then what I do is I make a thin coil of clay to add to the join as well. So I just wet down the surface that I'm working on to make sure it doesn't dry out the clay too much. Make a sort of sausage shaped piece of clay and then roll it out with my fingers. And when I'm rolling, you can see there I'm just twisting the clay. That stops it from flattening out as you roll. And then rolling with both hands, spreading your fingers quite wide, and the action when you're rolling is just to move your hands outwards, and that sort of stretches the clay out into a longer, thinner piece, an even piece. And if you do find that the clay is flattening out, you can, as you saw earlier on, just twisting it like that and then continue to roll, and that will stop it from becoming flattened, and it keeps it in a nice sort of spherical tubular shape. So just roll it out into a long, thin coil of clay, long enough to go around the entire pot. And then I'm just using a roller there just to flatten it out slightly so that it doesn't, so that it's easier to blend in once it's applied. And then when you've rolled out the clay coil, just position it around the join on the 2 pinch pots that you've joined together, and then blend it in. This clay is quite soft, so I don't slip and score this piece of clay, and it attaches pretty well because the new coil of clay is very soft, and also it's being applied to the join, which has got slip on it as well. It's freshly joined together, so it's reasonably soft. So just blend it in on the upper side and the lower side, and you'll see that when you blend it in, you get like a little ugly ridge around the join, but don't worry about that, because what you're going to do is just scrape off most of the excess of that coil using a metal rib. And when you scrape it off, you're leaving enough of the coil on the surface to make sure that the bond has been reinforced, but you're just not leaving an ugly ridge of clay around the middle. Now the sphere itself is completely enclosed, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to blow a little bit of air into the sphere just to inflate it a little bit to make it firm enough to work on really easily. So I make a little coil of clay, which is about the width of my pinky finger, and then I cut it so that it is about 1 inch long. And then it just needs to be shorter than a cocktail stick. Then I blend the little clay coil onto the sphere, and then once it's fully blended on, you push the cocktail stick into the little clay coil right the way through into the circle of clay, and then take the cocktail stick out, and that little hole goes right the way through, and then you can blow into the clay sphere, inflating it just a little bit and making it really firm. And you just be careful not to blow too hard, because then you can rip the seam. So once you've blown a bit of air in, you pinch the clay coil to seal it, and then blend that clay coil onto the surface of the pot. So then I mark the top of the sphere with a wooden tool, making a cross on the top. And the reason I do that is so that I can remember where the top of the sphere is and where the seam is, because once you start tidying up the surface of the sphere, it's very difficult to know where the seam is running, and then you can end up later on when you open it up and add the lip to the pot, the seam, if you've forgotten where the seam is, the seam can end up running, and you cut a hole in for the opening at the top, you can end up with the seam running right across the lip of the pot, which is really ugly. So mark a little X on the top of the sphere, and then as you can see, what I'm doing is I've got the clay sphere on a cushion covered with an old towel, and I'm using a shredding tool to just remove a lot of the old lumps and bumps from the outside surface of the clay. The shredding tool is, this is a Mud Tools shredding tool, and you can also just use something called a shore form, which is more of like a DIY shredding tool, which works just as well. The good thing about the shore form is it's designed so that the clay will just kind of can easily be removed once it's been shredded away. Removed from the tool. The shore form, it tends to clog up a little bit, but the Mud Tools tool, all the scrapings just kind of crumble out of the shredding tool. So as I'm doing this, it does create a lot of mess, so I just sort of rub off any grated bits of clay from the surface and tidy it up a little bit, and then tidy up some of the shredded bits, and they can go in the recycling bin. And then just carry on. Once you've tidied up some of the mess, you can carry on just refining the surface. And as I say, the point of doing this is just to get rid of a lot of the lumps and bumps from the clay, and get rid of some of the bulk as well, because at the moment the walls of the pot are still relatively bulky. And then, but the shredding tool leaves behind, obviously it's a serrated surface. So you just need to use your metal rib tool to get rid of that texture. And then again, I use the rubber rib just to compress the clay and give it a nice smooth finish. And then what I'm doing there is I'm just sort of patting it a little bit just to improve the shape of the sphere, because you've done a lot of work to it and it can get a little bit sort of squashed and out of shape as you're working on it. So just patting it into the as close to a sphere as you can. Then, as you can see, I've got you can probably still see that there's the little cross on the top that's still there. And then I'm just using my hands to just sort of squeeze it into a shape that I like, because now I'm sort of thinking about making it into the jug, or the pitcher, whatever you want to call it. So I'm just sort of making it into more of a kind of a pear shape. Instead of an apple or an orange, I'm sort of using the paddle there to just tap it into what's more like a pear shape or a teardrop shape. And at this point, there's various different ways that you can shape the clay. You can pat it with your hands, you can pat it with a wooden tool. What I'm doing there is I'm just rolling it on the work surface a little bit, just to, again, work on the shapes until it's a shape that I'm happy with. The only thing that you've got to be careful with when you're doing this is just to go slowly and not to expect too much of the clay, because it is sealed. The seal is still a little bit fragile, so just be careful that you don't push it too far, because then you can find that the seal, where the two pieces of clay have been joined together, that can open up if you push it too much. So what I'm doing there is I'm just sort of eyeballing it really, and going around looking at it and seeing if there's anything on there that doesn't look like it's quite shaped quite right. So once I'm happy with the shape of the sphere, as you can see it's a little subtle egg-shaped sphere now, I just put it to one side and I start making a foot ring for the picture. So I do this by rolling out a coil of clay in the same way that I did before. If you're interested in learning a few tricks on how to roll an even coil of clay, I'll put a link in the video to another video that I made on that subject just now. So you drape the coil around the base of your picture and then cut it at a diagonal on one end, and then line it up and cut it on a diagonal at the other end. So you're cutting it to the right length, and then you score one end and then the other. And it's best to cut it on a diagonal because it'll just make the join stronger. And then paint a bit of slip on either end, and then blend it together so that you're making a clay ring or donut. Then just drape the base, the clay ring, along the base of the picture, and then what I do is I pinch the clay ring a little bit to square it off, because I'm going to be blending that. I'm going to be attaching that to the base of the picture, and I want to make it into approximately the shape that I want it to be when it's actually attached to the base. So just pinching it a little bit to shape it. And again, what I'm doing there, I'm not actually attaching it to the base now, but what I'm doing is just blending it with my finger a little bit so that, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this to firm up. I'm going to leave the clay ring to firm up for a few hours. So when I do attach it, it is going to be a bit hard. The clay is going to be harder than it is now, and it just makes the blending and attaching process a bit easier if you sort of shape it a little bit before you let it dry off. So make sure it doesn't actually stick to the base. So shape it and then just peel it off to make sure it doesn't get stuck on there. So I shape it and then I leave it in position, and I cover the body of the picture and the foot ring in place for a few hours, cover it up with a piece of plastic, and then leave them together for a few hours just so that the foot ring is the same moisture content as the picture. And then once I've done that, I use a needle tool just to mark around where the inside of the foot ring is going to go. And then I use the serrated rib tool just to score into the base of the picture. Doing a bit of cross hatching there with the serrated tool, and then also scoring into the underside of the foot ring too. And then apply a bit of slip to both sides. Apply it to both the base of the pot and also to the foot ring as well. And then put the foot ring in place and gently but firmly put some pressure on there just so that it sticks really well to the base. And then using the wooden tool again, or you can use your thumb. Again, I find the wooden tool a bit easier. Just blend the foot ring onto the base. And then once I've blended the outside, I also blend the inside edge of the foot ring too. Partly to make sure that it's firmly attached, but also just because I prefer the way it looks. Now at this point it looks a little bit messy, so what you can do is you can use the wooden tool just to tidy it up a bit, get rid of some of those ridges. And I'm just using my thumbs there just to press the base down a little bit to make sure it's nice and flat. And then using my fingers, I'm just tidying up the underside as well. And here I'm using the platter tool just to scrape away some of the ridges that are made by the wooden tool. Just makes the tidying up process a bit easier. And then just compressing the clay down again with the rubber rib just to make it nice and smooth. And then what I'm doing here is I'm using the shredder just to level off the foot, because at the moment it's quite rounded and a bit uneven. So I'm just shredding some of that base away so that the foot is going to stand nicely on the table. And then just tidying it up with the metal rib and with my thumb. And then I put the picture up the right way, and I'm just using my modelling tool, wooden modelling tool there, to just tidy up the edge of the foot as well. And here I'm just using the paddle just to tap it back into shape, just in case it's lost any of its shape whilst I was working on the foot ring, making sure it feels and looks even. And just squeeze it with your hands as well. I'm going to make the neck of the pot now. That is just a little rubber guide ring. It's actually a guide ring that you can use on a rolling pin, but it's quite nice to make the neck of pots because it's rubbery shape. It's rubbery, so it shapes around the pot quite nicely. And then just cut out with a craft tool the section of clay that's going to form the neck. And then just using your fingers you can start to shape the neck a little bit. I'm going to build up the neck of the spout of the the picture using some coils of clay. So I'm just making a coil of clay, which I'm going to add to the spout. So put it in place and then just mark where, sort of eyeball it, mark it where you're going to cut it. And then put it into position. And really now what I'm doing is I'm just shaping it. I'm not attaching it now, I'm just squeezing it and shaping it so I know how it's going to look once it's been attached. And then scoring the neck a bit, and also the little coil of clay that's going to make the spout. Put a little bit of slip on. And then just attach it as firmly as you can. And then once it's attached, because that coil of clay is reasonably soft, you can shape it, you can still sort of sculpt it and shape it with your fingers. So I'm just blending it on there with my wooden tool again, making sure it's firmly attached. And then I just carry on using the wooden tools and also my fingers just to carry on shaping the spout and also continuing to blend it on there until I'm happy with the shape of the spout. And when I'm happy with the shape of the spout, then I attach the handle. I usually make handles by pulling the handle, and this is how I pull handles. So I start off by making a tube of clay, which is roughly the shape of a carrot or a sweet potato or a small pear, and then I hold the fat end of the clay carrot in one hand, in my left hand because I'm right-handed, and then I use my right hand just to wet my right hand and then just draw that down over the thin end of the clay carrot, and then just keep pulling the clay down. And as I'm pulling the clay, I'm turning it in my left hand and making it into as even a tube of clay as I can, coming out, being pulled down. So it's at this point it's circular. And then when I'm more or less happy with the length of the clay that's dangling down, then I start, as you can see, I'm using my finger and my thumb just to flatten the tube out a little bit, so that it's comfortable to hold, because if you use a handle that's very round, it can be a little bit uncomfortable. And then if I get a little fat end at the bottom there, I just pinch it off and keep pulling the handle until I'm happy with the length. And then when I'm happy with the length of the handle, I just curl it over and then pinch it off and put it on a wooden pottery bat to firm up. And I usually make a few handles at any given time, just so that I've got a choice about which one I use. And then any that I don't use, I can just keep in my damp box. And then I just trim it to length. I hold it up against the picture and just eyeball how long I want it to be, and then just trim it to length, cutting off the really chunky ends. Hold it against the picture where I want it to go, and then using my needle tool, just mark on the picture where I'm going to attach it. I just mark 4 points on the picture where I'm going to attach it. And then using my serrated rib, I just score into the surface of the picture and on the bottom as well there. And I do this as well as I can. It's really important, obviously, that the handle stays on really firmly. And then scoring the ends of the handle too. Really making a really nice rough texture there, and then applying a lot of nice gloopy slip. And putting it in position and just pressing it on as firmly as you can without causing any damage to the picture. And at this point the clay is quite it's leather hard, so you can put quite a bit of pressure on without crushing it, but you've still got to be careful that you don't damage it. So yes, just pressing it into place and starting to blend it in as well. Then when it's pressed firmly into place, what I do is I make a very small coil of clay. That's quite fresh clay, so it's quite soft and squishy. And then I just wrap it around the point at which the handle is attached to the picture and press it gently into place. And the reason for doing this is just to make sure that the handle stays on, make sure that the handle is very firmly blended onto the clay. And then I blend it in with my fingers. The first thing I do is I blend it in with my fingers just to make sure that it's in place, the coil is in place. And then once I've finished blending on the tiny clay coil onto the top part of the handle, then I repeat the process with the bottom part of the handle too, and just add a little coil onto that bit. And then when it's all blended in with my fingers, what I do is I use a tiny wooden tool just to make sure that the blending is perfect around both ends of the handle. And then I use a damp chamois leather just to wipe away any of the marks that have been left behind by the wooden tool, and also just to wipe away any clay slip that's left on the handle, or get rid of any small imperfections on the surface of the picture as well. The chamois leather only needs to be a little bit damp, just enough to remove any imperfections. If it's too soggy, then it'll just create a lot of slip on the surface of your piece, which you don't want. And then there it is, there's the finished picture, all ready to be dried and then fired and then glazed. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, then you'll get a notification next time I upload something new. Thanks for watching, bye!